it is also about acceptance of the present and one's full position.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever your duty is, the thing that you're supposed to be doing is paramount. I want to be good in like all capacity in any like format. A lot of people are trapped as well in philosophies that really are counterproductive to the way they are and the way they think.
I think they're more allowing.
More allowing?
Yeah.
In what sense?
I think a lot of enlightenment comes from...
So you want to start now then? I mean,
however you want. I mean, we can just kind of talk about the day. Like, I don't know. I for one am super stoked that we got like martial arts in. Like, kind of reminded me how much I missed it and like how much I need that to be a bigger part of my life. Because I think, because I started when I was 7, doing martial arts, and like that's always been a really big part of my life through high school. Kind of took a little backseat in college, and then kind of been off and on since then. And like even now, I still teach on weekends at like this taekwondo studio, but it's like we just do some cool like weapon stuff, so not like a lot of combat, not like jiu-jitsu, not like boxing or anything, just like demonstration weapon stuff, which is fun as hell. Like I still really like that, but like I need some more combat, you know, in my life.
Well, like what do you think got you into combat sports?
Got me into it? Well, I started because I didn't like soccer, because I was like the typical sport. It was like, oh, you just do soccer, right? And then I was like, okay, that ain't it, chief. And then I spent a little time. I was like 7, you know, so like my parents signed me up for,
you really were young.
Signed me up for like a martial arts class, and I'm like, this is sick.
Yeah.
There's something cool about just being a ninja. Like this is what you want to do, you know?
Yeah.
But even more so, I think there's something really empowering about having confidence in your ability to handle yourself, both physically and then also the discipline through that develops you mentally. It makes you a much stronger person. Like, I can't imagine what it would be like to enter a room without knowing that I can handle myself. Like, that's going to be terrifying because you're just at the mercy of fucking whatever.
Yeah.
So
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And it is, I feel the same way, and I also got into it young, but what brought me back is what you're speaking about, which is that sort of getting that confidence in your own abilities and having a real practical skill that you can employ, you know what I mean? And I started off young, but I lacked the maturity to really appreciate what was going on, and for me to really fall in love with the sport, because I tried boxing when I was about 13, and it was cool, and it did teach me a lot. It drilled some fundamentals into me, which was cool, which is nice. But I didn't have what I have now, and that I've gotten, you know, especially like growing up, coming out of high school and sort of going down the more philosophical route and that sort of like embracing of pain. But yeah, and I think even seeing today with the other guys, it speaks to a lot of people more than they think it would. So like they might be a bit like apprehensive at first, but then like once they get into it, they really do get into it, and they really do enjoy it, because there's just something innate in us, especially us guys. I mean, with some like, you know,
100%.
with some good people, and there's a bit of sport involved, you know, and you're
built for it. Like as a human being, you're built for it. Like how we evolved as hunter-gatherers, tribal days, like your monkey brain has like a little switch that comes on. Like part of it is survival, but it'll switch you on to like, oh, I'm in it now. We gotta fight, and it'll make you fight. It'll let you do it.
Fight, yeah.
And it feels good sometimes.
Yeah,
like there's a lot of power that you feel, and this is why I think like I appreciate martial arts as an art form just as much as like a combative sport, because of like even like people like, you know, talk down on certain martial arts because like, oh, that's not applicable. Like that always like shows me how immature someone is. Because applicable to what? Like, sure, no one's doing Tai Chi to get in a street fight. No one's doing that. Like, that's not even part of the conversation. No one believes that, right?
Yeah, no, 100%, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, why are you even here, like, saying, oh, this is useless BS? Like, yes, it is. You're right, but, like, useless for what?
Yeah, exactly.
Martial arts, fundamentally, for me, has been, like, a playground of principles, right? So there's so many fundamental principles that you get out of martial arts that you don't really see. You see other places because they're fundamental principles and the dots do connect. But martial arts has like such a high level across the board of all the principles that I deem valuable, right? And, you know, just from like discipline, self-awareness, dealing with patience, dealing with pain and suffering, perseverance, like the list goes on and on. Delayed gratification, you know, being able to conquer your own insecurities, confidence. It's immeasurable, and nothing else that I've found has those qualities as principles to the level that martial arts does, broadly. And this is why, like, I'm really lucky that the martial art that I first started was called Bakufudo. It's a mixed style, so it had elements from like Taekwondo, karate, jiu-jitsu, kickboxing, kung fu. Like, it had a bunch of different elements kind of mixed in its own little style, with the goal of being able to like handle any kind of situation against any martial artist. So it exposed me a little bit to like jiu-jitsu kind of stuff, striking arts, kickboxing, MMA. And so now that has allowed me to explore other martial arts as a whole, rather than just being like a fanboy of one. It's like there's a lot of people like, oh, I only do Taekwondo, that's the best. Well, for this situation, yes. But wouldn't it be cool to be able to do that when you need it, but then also do this when you need that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I mean, I want to be good in like all capacity in any like format, you know, on the ground,
you have the
standing up.
to.
You have the potential. Exactly. You have the potential to. So why
so you
would
have the responsibility to.
Exactly. So this actually brings me to a question, because you were speaking about Buddhist philosophy and their perspectives of pain and acknowledging it and taking it on board, and that helps you like better deal with it. So I was wondering if you're familiar with Stoicism at all.
Yes.
If you're into Stoicism, because like there are a lot of parallels you can draw between the two, because for Stoics it is also about acceptance of the present and one's full position, and then whatever your duty is, the thing that you're supposed to be doing is paramount to nothing else. So it doesn't matter the pain or the agony or whatever might be associated with that situation isn't really the important thing. It's about doing what you need to do.
100%.
So yeah, because I'm being into Stoicism, so that's kind of like the perspective. But I mean, like I say, the lines really do blur between the two. So
most philosophies, and this extends into like religions and spiritual practices as well, they really talk about the same thing. And that's just evidence to me that, hey, like, we're onto something. You know, it's like if multiple different groups or people from multiple time periods across the world come up with the same relative conclusions, it's like, oh, that's probably something you should listen to, right? But one of the reasons why, like, I when I gave my little workshop the other day, I did talk, a lot of it was kind of framed around Buddhism, because that's like a very like fundamental part, and there's it was kind of like the track of the story I wanted to tell. But there was definitely some like Stoicism. I had like a Seneca quote in there as well. Quote, yeah. So it's very relevant, and there is a ton of overlap. But some of the reasons why I didn't go full Stoicism was because I know a lot of you guys already have that perspective.
That's true.
So I also want to like enrich you in a way that some people aren't expecting, because that's where you find a lot of really creative, novel ideas from, and that's where something really special comes out of, because just doing what everyone's already read, like whatever, sure, we've already heard that, why am I here, you know? But if I have a better chance of giving you something that is not what you're expecting, I'm more often than not going to try for that. So it's kind of like just the story that I wanted to tell, as well as just a different perspective.
I mean, I think you did a good job as well.
Thank you.
The story told with the buffalo and the cow, and that storm situation. I mean, no one here is going to forget that, you know.
It's pretty impactful, yeah.
Yeah, so it's cool. It's cool to impart that onto like people, like you're saying, really deliver just another perspective, something fresh, something that's hard hitting, you know, and that sits with people. So 100%. Yeah.
I was really impressed too with you guys. I think it was Menashe, Cool Drink. He had a different perspective about it. So like, you know, the buffalo, they go into the storm, so they suffer less because they face it head on. They don't worry about it, and they get through it faster, versus cattle, they run away, so they're worrying about it, and then they also spend a lot more time in the storm. But he also said something about like, you face the storm to chase grass that's been watered already, whereas the cows are running away from the pain, and all they're getting is grass that hasn't been watered yet, so it's dead. And like, that was such a deeper level to that story that I've never heard anyone else say, and I haven't even thought of myself. And I was like, whoa. That was a beautiful insight, really cool to see how my stories can influence someone to self-generate another idea and enrich the entire group. And I was like, I'm really just grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that. That's like why I'm here.
Yeah. No, 100%.
That was awesome.
No, yeah. So I was curious about like your philosophy in general. How did you start getting into it?
That is a
long
question.
For me personally,
Yeah.
it was through Adam Watts actually in high school.
Yeah.
And he talks a lot about Taoism and stuff like that. And also again about just not being too caught up in things in a lot of ways, and just letting the flow of things happen. And I think that really sort of helped me, especially in a high school setting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you go into high
especially.
school, and as much as people, you know, it's always like be yourself. It's you never are.
It's so fake.
It's so fake, and you do try and fit in, and you do try certain things.
Because they tell you to like, oh, be who you are. By the way, you have to check off every single box in this checklist.
Yes.
To become what we expect you to become.
Yes.
Good luck.
Yes.
It's like, what the hell?
Yes.
It's absurd.
Yes. No, it is absurd. It is absurd. So I was kind of glad, and I had a friend who was also interested in that kind of influenced me. So that was nice, because I think it did fast track a lot of problems that I could have sat with for a while. I didn't have to anymore, which helped me.
You learned how to be a person, like a human being, earlier than most, because that's one of the things that traditional education does not do. It doesn't teach you how to be a person. That's kind of left to like, well, maybe your parents will.
And you have to be inquisitive.
If they're even able to, because sometimes
Yes.
your parents don't even know how to be a person.
Yes.
Like, just fully embrace who you are as a human being. And this is why, that's another reason that got me kind of into philosophy, is like, things aren't adding up, right? It's like, what am I going to do about it? And that kind of leads you on this journey, this rabbit hole of self-exploration. But I do remember, because I'd probably say a lot of my personal growth came from during the period when I was in university. Because like before that, just going through high school, very like academic, focused on like, I have to be a perfectionist, I'm smart, I have to be the smartest person, and I have to do these hard academic things because that's what smart people do. And it was completely like external. And like, well, part of it was internal because I do still have a passion for those kinds of things, but the actual reasons and perfectionistic aspect of that did not come internally, right? And that led to a lot of conflict, because there's a conflict of interest from external versus internal, and that's going to lead to a lot of pain, which you attach to one of those ends, and that leads to suffering. So in college, I first year I took an ethics course, which, to be fair, didn't get a ton out of that. But what it did do is it exposed me to like a bunch of different philosophers. So like we went through like Nietzsche, Kant, Lao Tzu was also kind of in there as well. So like I was exposed to the Tao Te Ching, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Let's kind of read this. Let's read more about this. And it started kind of getting more eclectic perspective of all these different philosophies on my own time, even after I took that class. And it's hard to say what exactly led me to a lot of the things that I learned, but somewhere during that time I also got into like a more like spirituality from both Western and Eastern sides, meditating, Wim Hof breathing, and just kind of experimenting on like how to change my mind and my body and the interplay between those, because they're not really that different when you kind of understand them more, and then how that relates to your spirit, because that's like kind of also a separate thing, but people often kind of stop at it being separate, but it's also the same. It ends up being very like circular, because the path to enlightenment, I guess, is not a straight line up the mountain. It's more like a kind of a spiral. It's like an infinite spiral path where you end up looping back on the same lessons sometimes, but you gain new ones along the way, right? And appreciating that process through like, going with the flow, like what Alan Watts talks about, is like very, very important for detaching from the results of like you're never going to get to enlightenment by trying to be enlightened. You're only going to get to enlightenment by appreciating that this is an infinite process. And then it's this very like contradictory thing where you actually get what you want by not needing what you want, because you no longer have the desire, and therefore you no longer have the lack. It eliminates it completely. It's kind of weird. But through that kind of whole time period is kind of where I started getting a lot into that, and then just picked up things along the way. It's hard to say I had a particular path or flashpoint that really led me down that path.
But it's always nice to have a full range of things. Like you're saying, you got that eclectic perspective, because it's important. You'll take some things and you'll reject some things. You've got to form. There's no absolute truth, and so something might identify to a large degree for you, and like, geez, it's almost 100%, but it's not really. And there's like things you can like pick and learn from.
Yeah.
So it's nice to have that full broad perspective.
I love how casually you said there's no absolute truth. Because you kind of accepted that. You kind of accept that as a truth, that there's no absolute truth. I know it's kind of weird like that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But it's interesting to also to see, like, I talk with people like you, where it's like, oh, there's no absolute truth, and it's like very clear, very kind of obvious. Like, oh, of course not, because it's all relative based on perspective. Like, maybe there's some absolute truth, but no one has it, because like they're all just different reflections, different facets of that source, God, truth, whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
And that's what kind of makes a lot of sense to me. And it's interesting because, like, I've recently interacted with some people who are very like, what do you mean there's no, like, no, there's absolute truth, you idiot. And it's like they're very, very clear on the other side.
Interesting.
And it kind of makes you step back, like, wait a minute, am I wrong? Like, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
Kind of makes you question things, which is good, but you also have to understand, like, people think things for a reason. Like, no one's just really, like, no one's like that stupid. Like, you know what I mean? Like, no one's like actually an idiot sometimes.
Yeah.
But everyone has a reason for thinking the way they do.
Yes.
And appreciating the fact that if I were in their situation with their upbringing and their environment, I would think that way too.
100%.
100%. So when they say, like, oh, there's no absolute truth, and then you ask them kind of more questions, like, okay, so do you think, like, your religion is like the absolute truth? It's like, yes. Okay, so okay, follow-up question, like, do you think your religion is the entire truth? Like, every bit of truth is in your religion? And they're like, yes. And then the follow-up question to that is like, okay, does that mean then that every other religion, we're just using that as an example, but you could apply basically anything to that, is fully wrong? Because if yours is fully right and there's a absolute truth, then that must mean, by consequence, that this is fully wrong.
Fully wrong.
And they're pretty much like, well, yeah, that makes sense. I'm like, whoa. That was kind of like a... I had to... at some point, you can't just, like, straight up tell people they're wrong.
Yeah.
Right? Because, like, I don't even know. Maybe they're right.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But that was kind of like an interesting perspective. Like, whoa, like, that's a very, very different level of conviction for a different thing than, like, I've explored and discovered. And because my worldviews are based on my best guess of what I think is happening.
Yeah.
But it might be wrong, it might be whatever. But it's interesting to see, like, certain levels of conviction across different religions and their willingness to even accept new information, let alone change based on that new information. So that was just kind of like an interesting conversation I had with that person.
Yeah. And it is interesting also with people who claim this to be an absolute truth, but then haven't read another religious text. So then how can you say that without having done, like, your full investigation to really determine, like, what is what?
Absolutely.
You know? So you are basically just a circumstantial, let's say, Christian or Muslim. So it's largely based on where you're born. In fact, it's entirely based on where you're born. So if
isn't it convenient that, like, oh, you just happen to end up in the right one? Lucky you. Everyone else is going to hell, but lucky you.
But if you'd put yourself in someone who was born into a Muslim country and they're Muslim, it's like you're the same person.
They think the same way.
And so you exactly. So for someone who has read the religious text and they find, like, whatever they find, I can respect that, because at least they've considered the board.
I think it's so important. That's an incredibly important point you brought up, to expose yourself to things and actually fully question your beliefs. Because there's a quote by, man, I always forget the guy's name, but I'll figure it out at some point. We question all of our beliefs except those that we hold most dear. Those are the ones we never think to question. Because a lot of times people, they have their beliefs and then they just assume they're true. And the most strong ones are just the deepest assumptions that they have. They never question them. So how do you know if it holds up? If you truly believe in something, it is not only, like, your responsibility, but it's your duty to question that. Because don't you want to see if it holds up? What if it doesn't? Are you scared? I think a lot of people are.
A lot of people
are just scared.
That is true.
So they just make these bold, brash claims to really convince themselves that they're doing right. Because people don't like to be told that they've done things wrong their entire lives.
Yeah.
Definitely. Even though once you kind of go through that process, you then realize, no, you didn't do things wrong your entire life. You did things in a way that was necessary your entire life, because everything happens for you.
Yes.
It leads you to the point you are. Yes. Your past is destiny, and your future is your free will.
Yes.
And as long as you keep that perspective and act accordingly, I think that's a very, very powerful place to live life from.
I agree. And that actually made me think of another quote, which is, you never learn the thing you think you already know. Which is true, and you don't. And for the reason you pointed out, I think a lot of the time it is just fear of really finding out the truth, you know? And that's why we don't always dig that deep inwards.
Do you think it's fear of finding out the truth, or is it fear of being wrong?
Interesting. That's, yeah, because there's the distinction between the two. I think when it comes to existential things, there might be the fear of just being wrong. And it's, yeah.
Well, that gets into an ego conversation.
Yeah.
And like the strength and weaknesses.
And yeah, I guess also
the
the
role
fear of
the ego
the truth.
plays.
Yeah, it's like you fear the truth because like if you are wrong, yeah, it's tough. It's tricky. Existential things are tricky and they do make us act.
Well, it means you don't know anymore.
Yeah.
And uncertainty is kind of like a hardwired human avoidance because your monkey brain is like, I don't know how to survive. Even if you logically know this is a better thing, people will usually default to what's familiar with them because even if it's like garbage, even if it's terrible, but your brain is like, that's familiar. We know we can survive because your brain is like, you have this like subconscious operating system that just like keep this meat bag alive at all costs, no matter what. And that's like a very like hard thing to overcome, especially if you don't have a good relationship with your ego.
So what is your classification of an ego?
Good question.
Yeah.
I think it's important to start with kind of most people's classification or definition of ego, which is usually a negative thing. Like it's usually considered in a lot of like spiritual circles, especially like the new age stuff, that like your ego is the enemy. It is bad. It is something that keeps you self-centered and locked in old patterns, and the faster you can kill that thing, the better. But I disagree. I think the ego is your co-pilot. Your ego supports whatever narrative you give it. That is what it's designed to do. And it's hard to like tangibly describe what an ego is. So I usually come at it as from a perspective like, what is this? What purpose does this thing hold? Right? Because at the end of the day, like it holds some purpose, and it's important to understand like, well, what did that thing do for me, whether you want to accept it or not. So with an ego, like I was saying before, like it is your co-pilot, but it's also like needs to keep it in its place. An overactive ego, which usually actually is a damaged or a weak ego, that's when people kind of let it take over, because then they're reactive to situations and they're reacting based on fear of being wrong or being attacked or whatever, and their ego kind of comes into play, takes the main seat in the pilot's chair, and then runs the show, right? But if you actually have a strong ego, a protective ego, it will protect whatever narrative that you give it, and you are no longer able to be swayed by the whims of the world, basically, or external things, because you know who you are, and your ego serves that purpose.
Is that like framework that you can sort of just set yourself in and be
100%.
solid? Yeah.
More or less,
So
yeah.
do you think ego then nature or nurture? To what extent is it nature? What extent is it nurture?
Nature and nurture is a very interesting conversation.
It is. There's a few. There's another question I
Right.
want to bring up with
We'll
this.
get there.
but
We'll get there. Because ego being nature or nurture. I think ego is probably more nurture than nature. At least that's kind of what I'm thinking right now, because a lot of it can kind of be taught. And the fact that I can change my relationship with my ego means I can nurture it, right? So the nature of the ego is inherent, but it might be more like consistent across humanity, like what it means to like be a human, like have a soul. Maybe that's something tied to an ego. And then how your relationship manifests is more like your nurturing your environment, your expectations, external things, and also internal things. So I'd probably lean more on nurture than nature for ego. But now that we're kind of on the nature versus nurture topic, what do you think about like humans in general, like how we turn out? Like ego is a part of that, but there's also more. So like, what do you think, nature versus nurture?
I think most of it is nature. No, it depends. It's interesting.
It's tricky.
It is tricky, but so ultimately nurture.
Ultimately,
Ultimately nurture.
does it have to be one thing? But obviously it's not.
So I think if I can like start from the beginning with, if you look at kids, right, and you ask yourself, is violence inherent or is it taught? But if you just let kids interact, they are actually incredibly violent. Like if you take my toy, the knee-jerk reaction is to
monkey
hit.
brain, like,
and then
violence.
you come and you teach like, no, like we don't hit, right?
You nurture that.
So you nurture that in. So you see. So I think we have the potential to be fully nature in an uncivil society. But because we're in a civil society, we are largely molded to our surroundings.
So does that sort of mean, because I know you said casually earlier, like there's no objective truth, is there objective morality?
I think so. I think so. And yeah, this is very true.
So how much of what we deem as objective or right morality is actually nurtured versus nature, you know? Because in my perspective, if something is objective or inherent, it would have to be nature, right? Because given any circumstances, it would be repeatable. Like, let's say, another alien civilization, if there's objective morality, they're going to have the nature to manifest that in their society as well. Or even if you just drop a kid off in the middle of nowhere or a little society there, they would kind of recreate that level of morality as well. So
I see what you're saying, and it is interesting because like the objective answer to that question would change depending on where you go in history.
Right.
So that does change its
because things don't need things. I think things can still be objective and not be constant.
Yes.
That's a weird one to say, but like objectivity doesn't really mean constant, because constant would imply over time. Yes. Right? A constant in time.
Yes.
But objectivity could be relative to the age.
It could be.
By so many factors. That's an interesting
perspective. Yeah. And that's why I think ethics becomes an interesting discussion also when you're seeing, is ethics absolute?
Right.
Because people also say like, well, back in the day when they were doing, if you look at Nazi Germany, slavery, communist Russia, North Korea,
right?
When you look at all those, I just lost my points actually.
Yeah.
Let me just think.
But it is relative though to what purpose it serves.
Can I touch back on my point?
Sure.
So what they're saying is, in those situations, in those bad situations, if you were to ask someone like, is what we're doing right, but you ask the German, he'd say yes, right? But ethics is tricky because ethics is saying that it still exists even if you're unaware to it, but you haven't been enlightened to the fact that ethics is there, but it still applies because by and large people would condemn that behavior,
right,
and do condemn that behavior in hindsight, and so there were ethical issues present even if they aren't recognized as ethical issues, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Who gets to decide that though?
If it was present or not.
Is it just the victors? Is it just the people who write the history books? Or is it more sort of implied that, like, well, over time, the right ethics will come through and manifest?
I think that's the thing, because I think ethics is such a... You got to almost consult the human spirit, where it's like, is murder correct? Like,
right.
You know what I mean? It's on so many fundamental issues where the people on top, yes, are normally cruel. And when they do write their history books, they take a certain narrative. But if you were to do interviews with the general population, what are their thoughts? What are their feelings? And you see, and it's different because people are probably going to be like, no, what we're doing isn't right.
Do you think there's a difference between... So if you're like using an example of like murder is bad, right? Like most people would probably say that's a thing that they agree with. But does this idea of objective morality apply just to humans? Because there are entire ecosystems that rely on murder, right?
So murder, it's different because murder, I'm not killing because I need to kill.
I guess that's interesting, like versus necessity.
Yeah.
So I guess it's just a question. I guess the fundamental question I'm trying to ask here is, does objective morality apply universally, or is it just more of a human thing? And then follow-up question is like, what makes humans so arrogant to think that they're above or different than anything else? Which, to be fair, could be true.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm not saying it's not a one way or the other. It's just a question.
Yeah, I think it is. Morality is a human question. I just don't think animals have that comprehension.
They don't have the capacity.
They don't have that capacity they don't have the capacity for a lot of things that we're capable of doing. And there's something about the human brain's complexity that it's able to sort of romanticize and be that poetic nature of our minds. It's beautiful, but it also can be sad, and we can like feel sorry for ourselves, and we have these certain emotions that animals don't really display. Jealousy maybe in dogs, but a lot of the time if you watch how animals behave, and especially lions when they're injured in the wild, they don't have the sense to feel sorry for themselves. They're injured, They don't
very
even
stoic.
like. They're very
do what's
stoic. They go,
required,
they lie down and they die. They don't. There's no. They lack that like extra layer where you start to reflect on things. And I think when you start reflecting on things, and you're in a society, especially now, where a lot of your needs are met, and you can kind of you left to your
you
own
don't
devices.
question if there's a different way.
Yeah, and like I think it leads. There's moral choices now that you can make, but there's no choice in the wild. It's all just very cut and dry. Choice. And they don't even make the choice.
Is there no free will then beyond humanity?
But it's not really a free will thing. It's just that it's not immoral for a lion to kill an impala. The same way I don't think it's immoral for me to kill an intruder coming into my house.
Fair play.
Do you see? Because there's that sort of context where, yes, in the situation when it's expected of you and that's what you need to do. And I think in the wild and for animals, they just do what is expected of them. But chimps are different. If you look at primates, they are different, and it
does exist on a spectrum.
So it does exist on a spectrum, actually. If I think about it, and if you look at animals that are closer to us, they act closer to us, where they maybe do something out of spite.
So, because everything is basically on a spectrum. Like I have enough evidence to, at least my working theory is that the universe that we live in is a dualistic universe. There's always polarity involved, but that doesn't mean that it's binary, right? That's working in too many absolutes, right? There's always going to be spectrums just defined by a dualistic endpoints, right? And then going from like certain animals versus like an insect versus a lion versus an impala versus a chimp versus a human, they're all kind of range in terms of this like objectivity of morality, ethics, nature versus nurture. And so like going back to kind of nature versus nurture, like I think that is also a big spectrum. I think humanity lies like more weighted towards the, like if you have nature on one side, nurture on the other side, weighs probably more closer to the nurture side than like a lion, right? And then chimps might be somewhere in between as well. So it kind of like the closer you get to humans, you're further along the nurture side. Not to say that there is no nature, and it would be kind of an interesting thought experiment to be like, okay, well, would there exist a being or a species or a race of aliens or whatever that would be fully nurture
or fully nurture?
Because fully nature, I feel like we kind of have examples of like a plant is kind of like, well, you can nurture it, but like let's say like an ant, maybe
all it's like
it's still working on programmatic responses to stimuli. All you're doing is controlling stimuli, which is kind of nurture. But actually, that brings another question: is what if our definition of nurture is really just programmatic responses to stimuli, and we just figured out the right stimuli to get a certain response for the survival? Maybe it's all nature. Who knows? You know, right. That's a very interesting question that I just kind of thought of. But I think practically, at least what's useful, because that's another kind of thing, is like a lot of times sometimes it's more like impactful to consider what's useful than what's true, right? And this is kind of a very like touchy topic sometimes, because some people prioritize truth absolutely, but if something's like not objectively true but is useful for me, well, it's useful for me, right?
I like that.
Yeah, so it's true. Like a lot of times I'll prioritize like, well, not just like, is that true? It's like, it doesn't matter. Is it useful, right? So I think understanding nature-nurture relationships is more useful, even if it's not true, because I would rather believe that I'm more capable of change, how I nurture myself, than maybe is reasonable to expect in truth, right? Because that's always going to push me to maximize that direction. A good, do you know who Tom Bilyu is?
I don't. So
Tom Bilyu he kind of like, his main claim to fame was one of the co-founders of Quest Nutrition.
Okay. It
was like a $1 billion nutrition company in America. They made like little like protein bars and things like that. They're pretty good. Okay. And then he sold that and then went full-time into his business now. It's called Impact Theory, where he has like kind of his online like university education style thing where he teaches people about like mindset and discipline and whatnot. And he also has a bunch of interviews with tons of different people and just trying to figure out like what's going on, right? He's a fantastic podcaster and video interviewer or whatever. He's a G, right? So he has kind of this thing where he understands that like you can't make a pig into a racehorse, but you can make a damn fast pig, right? Okay. And so he's like, hey, I know that I don't have all the attributes. I don't know that I don't have all the talent. I'm not by nature going to be the best. Like, so I'm basically the pig in this situation, but I can be a really fast pig, right? So he's just sort of like focusing on, understanding you can't necessarily control everything about your nature, but you can control your nurture and be a really fast pig, right?
And that's kind of Stoic, actually, right?
I think
because
it is.
Like he accepts he's a pig. I want to be a fast pig. I'm not going to try and be a racehorse, right? And it's that acceptance.
You're doing the most you can with what you have.
Exactly, right? And that's all we can really do.
100%, dude.
It's all you can really do.
I think just kind of maybe to wrap this idea up is another good analogy that I've thought about this is origami, because like I used to be like really into that back in the day, right? And looking at kind of like a piece of paper, like a square of paper, is very, very good analogy for like a human. It's like a blank slate, but it's kind of not, right? Like there are certain restrictions, there are rules to origami, like you can't cut, you have a square, it's one piece of paper, whatever. So there are limitations to the nature of a human. But a child is in a lot of ways a blank slate. 100%. So a blank piece of paper, right? And it depends on how you make those folds, how you crease the paper, how you mold this thing into one shape, one piece of art versus another. Like you could fold a origami crane, or you can fold yourself into a box. It's your choice, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people have been folded into a box based on other people's expectations. Obviously, they still make the choice. I think you have to take responsibility for that. The life that you got is the life that you chose. I believe that. But through societal pressures and expectations, it ends up like if you follow that path, you do everything you're supposed to do, you get folded into a box, right? And then people think, oh, I'm a box. That's it. I can't change. I think that's a huge fallacy. You can still reverse those steps, unfold the box, and then you think, oh, but I'm messed up. I'm no longer a blank slate. I have all these creases. Cool thing about origami is a lot of the same creases that it takes to fold the box are the same ones that you use to fold a crane.
That's interesting.
It's wild. So, yeah, sure, you might not have everything. There might be some wrinkles. You might have a little bit of scar tissue. But you can still fold yourself into a beautiful crane if you want to. Right?
A lot of those folds are still applicable, right?
Very applicable. Sometimes it's the same thing. It's just like, the order and the sequence of them is like, instead of this one being folded in on this one, it's actually that one first, and then you fold this one, and now it's a different shape, right? So I think I love that analogy.
That's a beautiful analogy, yeah.
No matter what box you folded yourself into, you can always use those lessons, those creases. The creases are just lessons. You can use them as restrictions or scars or lessons, right? I choose to use them as lessons. You can use those to fold yourself into a beautiful crane.
No, I like that. And also like how there's just it's more mainstream now, a lot of these philosophical ideas. I'd say that, but again, I'm biased, and my stream's biased because my stream obviously feeds me the stuff I watch.
Well, you have a self-awareness of bias. And I think that's important too, because you get to choose your bias.
100%. But it's nice to see an enlightened generation, or one that's far more enlightened than what was previously possible.
I think they're more allowing.
More allowing?
Yeah.
In what sense?
I think a lot of enlightenment comes from being open to allowing different perspectives to exist without needing yours to be right or wrong. Because I think a lot of people have this need or fear of like, if I'm wrong, or if you're right, that means I'm wrong. It's very binary, right? So I think a lot of, you're right, this generation has become enlightened in the fact that they acknowledge duality, but they also acknowledge range. They acknowledge to what, like, a dichotomy to be managed and not just like a binary one way or the other, right? And that comes into like allowing, right? Like you're allowing other things to exist while not feeling threatened, while not having your own worldview threatened.
Yes.
They can coexist.
Yes.
And I think that's very beautiful.
It is beautiful. And I think it's conducive to a better society in a lot of cases. And you even see it in economics. They picked up on people's propensity to do better when you let them do what they want to do. So you don't make the guy who doesn't really want to do wood work with wood. You sort of let him go and like, you see he really enjoys smithing because he's going to, put in the hours and become a better smith, right? Yeah. It's the same sort of thing if you allowing other things to exist around you and you're allowing that to happen, you find people find their grooves easier. They don't, maybe, because a lot of people are trapped as well in philosophies that really are counterproductive to the way they are and the way they think, and that can be difficult because it can be a conservative environment that you're coming from, and to change this would completely rock the boat, and like
it's unfamiliar.
And with your brain
sounds
like
the alarm bells,
and like and so for a lot of people, it's difficult, but once you start moving through that and people are able to choose their beliefs and find what they want to find without getting a lot of pushback, you find a society where people have more of a peace, I guess. And I mean, it's a very idealistic, and obviously in general.
But I think that's the trajectory a lot of people are heading to.
Yeah, and I like that. I do.
Yeah.
I think it's a healthy trajectory.
I think...
To some degree.
No, some of that definitely comes from maybe this like breaking down of world barriers, because there's a lot of like ideas that you're talking about that actually come... that have already been around in a lot of like Eastern traditions, whereas like they haven't been a very big part of Western traditions, right? And are you aware of the concept of ikigai? Okay, this is like an example of what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Ikigai is a Japanese idea of... it basically comes out to meaning your reason for being, your life purpose, right? And it's kind of like the visual is this Venn diagram of 4 circles of what you love doing, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can make money of.
Okay.
So it acknowledges like a very wide range of aspects of life, and then the intersection of all of those is your ikigai.
Okay.
Like if you can make money off of it and you love doing it, which means you're going to do well and you're good at it. Like see, they all kind of feed into each other because money allows you to do these things in perpetuity.
Yes.
Because you love it, that leads you to being good at it, and being good at it allows you to impact the world in a certain way because the world needs what you have, right? So they all interplay off of each other, and because the world needs what you have, you get value from it, and it kind of cycles itself again. And the intersection of all of those is your ikigai, and that's a like kind of an old, like ancient Japanese concept, but I think it kind of allows for the differences in ways of being that you're talking about, where it's like there's not one right way of being, because there's maybe one right way of being for you, but it's not me, right? Or and I think it's a very compact way of thinking about that as kind of like a decision filter for like what should you be doing with your life. Well, does it meet these criteria? That's a start, right?
I like that. Yeah. And I think the stream of nature comes through there in human beings, with the fact that so many ancient texts and ancient philosophy are so applicable, because there is this sort of that human condition and the human experience.
The human condition, yeah.
So but that's nice. It's nice that there are inherent things and things you do without knowing, but other people do as well, which is interesting. We have certain tendencies and certain ways that we're inquisitive, and so it's cool that there are like fundamental things that
100%.
are in so yeah, absolute. I think the human experience and the human condition is something that's absolute.
Interesting. So there are fundamental, like absolute things, but there's no objective truth. And I think these are reconciled by understanding, like, I'll use religion because it's very kind of quick understanding.
Yeah.
But I think all religions are really, like, they have the same God. They really do. They just are shown different facets, different faces of him, right? And if you want to personify God or whatever you want to vision that as, they're just showing different facets of a larger truth that you cannot comprehend in its entirety at one time. But if you start understanding, taking lessons and overlaps from different religions, you kind of start understanding, like, oh, it kind of completes itself. Because I don't really believe one religion is complete on its own, right? It just doesn't really make sense to me. And if you even tally up all the religions of the world, it's not quite complete, but it's a little bit more a picture of a... It's like, you know, if you were to have like a shape, a complex shape, and this kind of... I'm sure you're aware of like the allegory of the cave.
The cave?
Allegory of the cave from Plato, I think.
I'm not, actually.
Okay.
But it's, yeah.
So basically, quick rundown of this is like, if people are like prisoners locked in a cave, and the only thing that they have is the wall of a cave that's lit up, and there are shadows being cast on it. Their entire perspective of reality is just these 2D shadows, right? And then one of them escapes, sees the world for what it is, tries to tell other people, and then they reject him because that's not what they know, right? So, but it kind of comes back to the idea that, like, a lot of what people think are truths are just two-dimensional projections, shadows of a more complex three-dimensional reality, right? So one religion, like Islam, is just one angle of a shadow or a reflection of a facet of what truth or source or God is. Christianity is another. Hindu is another, right? And the ability to appreciate that those are different perspectives of the same thing allows and opens it up for a much more coherent and complete resonance with reality, I think.
No, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah.
I think there's one other thing I wanted to say though. Now that we're kind of on the topic of like all religions have the same God. I mean, the first thing that would come to my mind if I heard that is like, well, what about like a polytheistic religion, right? Like if you look back at all the mythologies or Hinduism for whatever, right? But the more because this is another like very influential class I took in college, was ironically a Hindu mythology class.
Okay.
It's kind of wild because that opened me up to a lot from that, right?
I mean, it's like thousands, hundreds?
It's like 1,000 and something named gods, but it's less about... I think the word God is a little bit of a presumptive translation because you have different classes of gods as well. Like you have the Asuras and the Devas, which are kind of like gods and demons, but they're kind of on the same level, just like, again, expressing the duality, the polarity of it all. Like they're not really regarded as good or bad. Like obviously like the gods are kind of like good, quote unquote, and the demons are bad, but they also appreciate that they're necessary for one another's existence, right? You kind of can't have them one without the other. And but they're really just like a different class of being from human, right? And it doesn't really acknowledge them as like God, as in like Christian God or Muslim God, right? It's a little bit different. And there's still other levels even within those gods of like, okay, well, what are the main gods and like this and that. But the deeper you look into it, you also kind of realize like, whoa, they're not even their own gods. They're really just different manifestations of different facets of God, right? So like Shiva would be more of like the destroyer and creator aspect of God, not a god on its own. It's just Shiva is the embodiment of that archetype, of that capacity of God. But it's only one part of God, right? Yeah, and then you have all the other ones kind of locking into their places, but they all are kind of just different embodiments and expressions that you can tell stories about to understand them. And that's really what mythology is. It's just stories of archetypes, right? To understand better source, God. There's a fantastic book, autobiography of a yogi. It's the story of this yogi, Paramahamsa Yogananda, and like how his journey of becoming what he is or was, and explaining a lot of these aspects of Hinduism and spirituality, and he acknowledges like other religions, primarily like Christianity, in that one as well. And he's like, yeah, no, that's actually talking about the same thing. It's just different perspectives, and like and then you might, and like when you see like a vision of God, it's not actually like that's God. It's just that's what source has chosen to appear to you as that will relate to you more. Because like if a Christian like has a vision of God and it's like 5-armed Vishnu or 10-headed Brahma, whatever, it's like, whoa, that's a little much, right? But they're going to relate to Jesus. They're going to relate to a prophet or something like that, right? And then vice versa. So it aligns with what you need at that time. And fundamentally, the conclusion that I kind of got out of this is that Hinduism, though like stereotypical polytheistic religion, is a monotheistic religion.
Right, because there's that one prime
source. There's one prime
that
source.
That manifests in different ways, which is interesting. That is interesting. Yeah, and I do agree with you. I'm more open to all the religions.
I appreciate that, Jason.
To pull the full
because like how quick you are to like accept it, like, and you get it. Like I appreciate the that kind of a conversation that I've had with you and the openness.
It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Good stuff.